2 months ago, version 3 of Starship left us with more questions than answers. A booster that couldn't stick its landing, a ship flying down an engine, and a whole community asking the same thing. Is this new design actually the one? On Thursday, SpaceX flew again. Here's what happened. My name is Felix. Welcome to What About It? Let's dive right in. Starship updates. What a time to be alive. Starship Flight 13 has happened, and there's a lot to unpack from this second flight of the version 3 vehicle. Is V3 the fix SpaceX has been hoping for? Can SpaceX still hit all its upcoming goals? Or are we looking at another year of grinding incremental progress? Let's find out together. It all started with a full 33-engine static fire on booster 20 on July the 10th, running for a full 24 ground shaking seconds, the longest test ever conducted on a super heavy booster. The following night, crews got to work on the chopsticks, chasing down an actuator that hadn't performed as expected. That work wrapped up the next day with the actuator replaced, clearing the path to a full stack. With every box checked, it was finally time to fly again. On Thursday, July 16th, SpaceX and the entire Starbase team were ready for Starship's 13th test flight, the second outing for the vastly redesigned V3 generation. Flight 12 hadn't managed to check off every item on its mission plan, and now it was time to prove once more that V3 was fully operational. As our live stream kicked off, the tank farm had already sprung to life, prepping for fuel transfer into both Starship stages. It's honestly incredible we're talking about Flight 13, just 5 weeks after the last launch. That prep work gets the pipes and valves ready for the volumes of supercooled pressurized liquid that rush through the system once fueling begins. The fuel transfer speed on these vehicles is worth calling out again. Both stages fully fueled in under an hour. In fact, just 37 minutes and 30 seconds, even faster than the Flight 12 timeline. SpaceX keeps shaving time off with every test, and that speed isn't a luxury. Genuine rapid reusability depends on it. As mentioned last episode, Pad 2 is reportedly designed for continuous use every 60 minutes. That capability is already baked into the design, and under active testing, even if launches themselves aren't happening rapidly yet. Here's another detail that lines up with the goal of making launches as routine as an airliner departure. The flight director runs the first major poll, the one that clears the vehicle for propellant loading, inside the final hour before launch, roughly 50 minutes ahead of T0. SLS, by comparison, runs its fueling poll a full 10 hours and 50 minutes before flight. That's the difference in philosophy laid bare. And if you're thinking that's just because SLS is an older, non-reusable design, think again. New Glenn starts fueling about 4 hours before launch, even though Starship carries 3 to 4 times the propellant. Here's a quick mind blower. Starship's combined fuel capacity sits at 5,250 tons, according to SpaceX's own figures. Fuel flow isn't perfectly uniform through the tanking process, but for simplicity, let's assume it is. Over that 37 minutes and 30 seconds, that works out to an average flow rate of roughly 2,133 kilograms per second, a staggering 140 tons of propellant per minute flowing into the full stack. 140 tons a minute. And again, the reason is rapid reuse. It's built into the design even before flights themselves become rapid. In spaceflight, you almost never trust a single instrument. Critical systems get backed up, and the smart move is always cross-checking your sources before committing to anything. Today's sponsor brings that same habit to AI. This segment is brought to you by Mammoth AI. Mammoth puts the best AI models in one place. Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini, Mistral, Grok, DeepSeek, and more. So instead of relying on a single provider, you can run a prompt through several and compare the answers, or just default to whichever model is sharpest that week. It also generates images and video, reads your PDFs and spreadsheets, runs deep research, and has a lighter, lower power mode for when you don't need the heavy hardware. And since it's a European company based in Paris with servers in Germany, your prompts aren't stored or used for training. All of that starts at just $10 a month. Find Mammoth at mammoth.ai. Link in the description. Try it out and support the channel. Back to Starship and Flight 13. But not everything was ready for a launch. SpaceX raced through fueling at blistering speed. Everything looked excellent. Then came ignition, and roughly 1 or 2 seconds in, the booster slammed on the brakes. A hard abort right after ignition. During the actual launch attempt on July 24th, we got the real explanation. Ice had built up inside the engines, most likely from the static fire just a day earlier. 4 of Super Heavy's 33 Raptor engines aborted at startup due to problems with their oxidizer turbopumps, the components that rapidly pressurize and feed liquid oxygen into the engine for combustion. For anyone who likes tracking the on-screen telemetry closely, this showed up right at T0 during that first attempt. Digging through the data afterward, engineers found off-nominal spin behavior in the oxidizer turbopumps on 6 of the engines. The likely root cause? Residual moisture had accumulated inside the pumps from earlier operations, which then froze once cryogenic propellant was introduced, either slowing those pumps down or stopping them from spinning entirely. That ice kept 2 engines from igniting, which is an automatic abort trigger. Losing 2 engines during initial ignition removes any margin for error, and even if the rocket could technically still make it, that risk wasn't worth taking. That's why the onboard computers scrubbed the launch. SpaceX rolled the booster back to Mega Bay 2 and the ship back to Mega Bay 1. Engines got replaced, and it looked like more than just the 2 problem engines were swapped out. A false start like that can damage other engines too, with pressure spikes, and cavitation being the biggest culprits. After the engine swap, SpaceX also dodged bad weather on the 23rd. The reason for that Thursday scrub? SpaceX wanted to image Starship from the ground during a faster than usual max Q, to stress test the heat shield further, and solid cloud cover makes ground imaging. During max Q, basically impossible, so the flight got bumped to the 24th, Friday. Friday was the day. Everything was set for the big show. Roughly 50 minutes before launch, SpaceX ran through the fueling pole, all clear. When frost lines started appearing, that was visual confirmation. Cryogenic oxygen was flowing in. 30 seconds later, the booster's oxygen tank followed. One of the biggest upgrades on the V3 booster is key to this faster tanking. There are now 2 separate quick disconnects at the base, one for liquid oxygen and one for methane, letting oxygen and methane load as independent operations. Methane loading kicked off less than a minute later. At T-minus 40 minutes, Ship 40's methane tank joined the process last, and from that point, every tank was filling simultaneously at 140 tons per minute. Before you can light a Raptor engine, you have to pre-chill it, so the hardware can survive the flood of super-cooled, high-pressure liquid about to hit it. All 33 Raptors on the booster, and 6 on the ship, began that chill-down process at T-minus 21 minutes. By the time the booster's loading procedure wrapped up, there were 2 minutes and 50 seconds left on the clock. 40 seconds later, the ship reached the same milestone. With the full stack fueled, the countdown ran down toward the 30-second mark, the point where it pauses for one final systems check, across everything involved in the launch and flight. The primary test objectives for this flight included a successful liftoff, stage separation, and deployment of 20 real Starlink V3 satellites, actual hardware on board this time. The team expected roughly 20 minutes of available time to run, a compressed set of tests, giving Starlink engineers a real chance to put the satellites through their paces. A series of polls ran in the background, and only once everything came back go did the flight director deliver the words everyone was waiting for. Prop load closing out on both vehicles, no holds on the board. Through the gate, still no holds. 50 seconds to go, Starship ready to fly, go for launch. At T-minus 17 seconds, the flame diverter deluge system kicked in, flooding the trench with water to soften the shockwaves. From the engines, 650,000 gallons, or 2.4 million liters of water per minute. 3 seconds before liftoff, the booster's engines got their startup command. 2, 1, and that was it. No way back. The only direction from here was up. Booster 20's 33 brand new Raptor 3 engines lit, slamming the flame diverter with a combined thrust of 8,240 tons. We've seen this trench work before, on static fires and on Flight 12, but it never gets old. Glad SpaceX got the Pad 1 launch stool design ready quickly back in the day, and just as glad it's retired now. Booster 20, with Ship 40 riding on top, leapt off the launch table and began climbing into the Texas sky. The speed it builds is hard to overstate. Even as the largest rocket ever built, Starship clears the tower surprisingly fast now that SpaceX has reached version 3. For perspective, Starship's thrust-to-weight ratio sits around 1.35. New Glenn is roughly 1.3. SLS is a bit higher at around 1.45, and Falcon 9, the roadrunner of the bunch, hits 1.7. The higher that number, the faster the acceleration off the pad. Through development, SpaceX managed to push this figure up considerably. Version 1 sat at 1.25 and noticeably lagged, clearing the tower. Version 2 hovered around 1.3, same as Flight 12. Clearing the tower meant Pad 2 was done for the day. Once again, there was no plan to bring either stage home to a catch this time. A ship catch is still on the horizon, but this flight was the missing piece that needed to fall into place first. One more clean run to validate the new design before the program pushes on to its next milestones. Since the first sign of trouble on Flight 12 was a lost booster engine, our eyes stayed locked on the engine diagram as the mission climbed. Around the 52-second mark, you can see something tear off the right aft flap. Probably not ice. More likely one of the heat tiles on the underside of the flaps, which is exactly why this flight deliberately flew through a tougher max Q, to stress test those tiles under higher aerodynamic load. Less than a minute in, Starship hit max Q, the point of peak aerodynamic stress on the entire flight, and this rocket moves fast, reaching max Q in just 58 seconds. Normally, this is where I'd ask you to like, subscribe, and become a channel member. But today I want to thank everyone who sent super chats during the launch stream. You made Jordan flip. You made it happen. We're getting him a $5,000 gimbal stabilizer for smoother helicopter footage. Nothing more to add except thank you. You all rock. For everyone else, like, subscribe, become a member or patron. Genuinely appreciated. Back to the launch. Flight 13 carried one important addition for SpaceX. The heat shield included load-sensing tiles that record the actual force the ship experiences. Why now, after 12 previous flights? Because this time, the vehicle was deliberately flown through higher dynamic pressure during ascent than any Starship before it, putting extra stress on the tiles and their mounting hardware. If that approach checks out, it opens the door to carrying more payload to orbit. The less you decelerate through max Q, the less energy gets wasted. One thing worth flagging during ascent: one of the center engines on Booster 20 had a pretty dramatic hiccup. It's not visible in the live stream footage, but NSF's cameras caught it. Might be a one-off, but worth noting. Starship kept accelerating through its climb, reaching the next milestone a little over a minute later, right on schedule. At 2 minutes and 18 seconds into the mission, most of the Super Heavy booster's engines shut down, a Starship specialty. Normally, MECO stands for main engine cutoff. On this rocket, it's most engines cut off, and the difference comes down to hot staging. Most rockets separate by shutting down the first stage, splitting the stages mechanically or pyrotechnically, and only then lighting the second stage. Starship's hot staging approach preserves more of the thrust already invested by holding some booster engines running, while the upper stage ignites its own engines and pushes itself off the booster, like a cheerleader pushing off her spotter's hands at the exact same moment they lift her, two motions in the same direction combining into a single push. Just 3 seconds after MECO, at 2 minutes and 21 seconds, hot staging began. Ship 40's Raptors lit and pushed the upper stage off the top of the booster, exhaust venting through the fixed strut structure of the V3 hot staging hardware we first saw last flight. And now came the part everyone was waiting for. If you watched Flight 12, you'll remember exactly where Booster 19 ran into trouble. Last time, slight timing differences in how the ship's engines started up sent the booster's flip off by roughly 90 degrees. And then, during the boost back burn, 5 of its 33 engines refused to relight cleanly, cutting the burn short and ending in a hard splashdown. SpaceX went to work on both issues. The startup sequence got reworked to be far more resilient to timing variability, so the booster flips correctly this time, and the engines received hardware modifications to improve relight reliability, with engine alarms and abort logic retuned to match real-world behavior in a multi-engine environment. Homework done. Now it was time to see if it held up. Jordan was back in the helicopter for this launch, by the way. Something you can actually do, too. These aerial shots are essential to my reporting. If you're down at Starbase, go book a flight with our official partner, SPI Helicopters, for the same views our photographers get. Genuinely unforgettable, worth every penny. Link in the description. At 2 minutes and 25 seconds, the booster executed its flip and lit its engines for the boost back burn. This time the flip was clean, and the engines fired up exactly as intended. The burn ran its full course and shut down around the 3-minute mark. Exactly what we wanted to see, and the best was still ahead. Booster 20 settled into its long coast back toward the Texas coast. This is where things went sideways for Booster 20 this time. Everything up to this point had been flawless. You could watch the booster gliding through the atmosphere, guided by its 3 grid fins. The landing burn started at 6 minutes 25 seconds, but the ignition pattern was erratic. Normally, the sequence starts with 13 engines, drops to 5, in a symmetric pattern, then down to 3. This time, the booster struggled to light all 13. 5 of 13 failed to ignite. It then tried dropping to 5 and began compensating by keeping other engines lit to cover for the failures. It fought hard, but it wasn't enough. We got a spectacular onboard view of the booster reaching the exclusion zone, but coming in too fast for a soft splashdown, it hit the water hard. Something clearly didn't work as intended. Maybe SpaceX will issue an official statement later. We'll have to wait and see. Unfortunately, that was the end of Booster 20. It was never actually meant to be caught by Mechazilla's chopsticks on this flight, and went into the water offshore instead. Not because it couldn't have been caught, but because this is a different design from the one already caught successfully, and it still needs to prove it's just as reliable. But the booster was only half the story. Now it was Ship 40's turn, and this second V3 upper stage still had plenty to prove. At 8 minutes, the ship shut down its engines right on schedule. Timing that matters. Since last flight, the ship lost one of its 3 vacuum-optimized Raptors about 40 seconds after separation. It still reached its intended trajectory on the remaining engines, but this time, the latest upgrades were being put to the test. Several hardware and operational changes went into the propulsion system to address the root cause of that earlier engine out on Ship 39. This time, every engine carried the ship cleanly through to cutoff on the planned suborbital trajectory. No drama in the engine bay. As with every Starship flight so far, the ship wasn't aiming for a stable orbit. It flew a ballistic trajectory designed to bring it back into the atmosphere on its own. Common misconception worth repeating: that's a safety choice, not a technical limitation. SpaceX could keep the burn going and reach orbit if they wanted to. The suborbital path simply guarantees that no matter what happens during the mission, the vehicle comes down in the Indian Ocean, far from any populated area. Next up, the secret stars of the show. At roughly 16 minutes, the payload deployment demo began, and this was a genuine first. For the very first time, Starship carried actual V3 Starlink satellites into space, real hardware rather than the dummy mass simulators used on earlier deployment demos. These aren't the same Starlinks currently beaming data to a dish on your roof. This is a new generation built to expand the network's capacity and improve user speeds. For this initial test, the plan called for 20 satellites to deploy, extend their solar arrays and antennas, and attempt to link up with the broader Starlink constellation via high-capacity laser links. This is a preview of what's coming a lot more of soon, since this is the very first operational job waiting for Starship, once it's fully up and running, taking over Starlink deployment duty from its older sibling, Falcon 9. That's not a small shift. Starship lets SpaceX deploy bigger satellites at greater scale, and the transition from Falcon 9 to Starship could end up being every bit as pivotal as the earlier shift from expendable rockets to Falcon 9. The satellites on this mission had a short life ahead of them. Riding the same suborbital trajectory as the ship, they were never meant to stay in orbit and were expected to burn up on re-entry roughly 20 minutes after deployment. SpaceX made a few of them special too. 6 of the 20 carried cameras aimed at scanning Ship 40's heat shield and beaming. Imagery down to operators, part of building out a reliable way to check heat shield condition before committing a ship to a return flight to the launch site. To give those cameras something to measure against, several tiles on the ship had been deliberately painted white, standing in for missing tiles as clean imaging targets. This kind of inspection step will almost certainly become standard practice on future flights. And the reasoning is obvious once you remember that a returning ship's path takes it across the continental United States on the way back to Texas. Better safe than sorry, since a Starship coming down over a populated area is the last thing anyone wants. Right on schedule, deployment wrapped up at 27 minutes. Then, at T plus 38 minutes, Ship 40 performed its in-space Raptor relight demo, successfully reigniting a single engine in the vacuum of space. Another box checked. Flight 12 skipped this test, Flight 13 completed it. Just under 9 minutes later, the final phase began. Barbecue time. Around 47 minutes in, Ship 40 hit the upper atmosphere for re-entry, the part of the flight that's reliably given us some of the best views in all of spaceflight. Plasma began wrapping around the hull and aerodynamic surfaces as the ship pushed into increasingly dense air. Now it was time for the heat shield to once again prove it could take the punishment, and as with previous flights, SpaceX packed this final act with more data gathering. Test tiles were mounted on the metallic side of the aft flaps, most likely to compare attachment methods, and the aft skirt carried special tiles too, some modified, some using different mounting mechanisms, all aimed at figuring out which options hold up best. At 1 hour 2 minutes, the ship went transonic in the upper atmosphere, decelerating hard as it dropped into a thickening air. Less than 40 seconds later, at 1 hour 3 minutes, it had slowed to subsonic speed, closing in on the Indian Ocean under control. This is genuinely the hardest part of full reusability. All that speed has to be bled off, and the shield has to protect the ship from every bit of heat generated in the process. That's what makes Starship's upper stage so much more difficult to develop than any other rocket's upper stage. The goal is landing back at base intact, ready to fly again after a quick inspection within hours. Now moving slower than sound, Ship 40 entered the final act. At 1 hour, 5 minutes, the landing burn started. 2 seconds later, the ship snapped into its landing flip. A maneuver that still looks slightly surreal given the ship's estimated dry mass of roughly 130 tons, flung around in the air like a toy. But, as they say, true mastery is making the difficult look effortless. The burn throttled down from 3 engines to 2, then to 1, and then came the classic SpaceX moment, the kind that drops jaws and that you simply don't see anywhere else. Ship 40 pulled off a soft splashdown, and soft barely covers it. Ships usually explode when they hit the ocean and tip over. Ship 40 came down so gently, it simply slid over onto its side, still fully intact. SpaceX's recovery crew reacted incredibly fast. The drone moved in over the ship, and for the first time in the Starship program, we got to see a heat shield in stunning close-up detail. Genuinely mind-blowing stuff. The shield looked great, A handful of missing tiles around the engine skirt edge, a few cracks scattered here and there, and most of the tiles under the aft flaps missing, but the hull itself was completely undamaged. Starship had effectively become Starboat, still transmitting telemetry and video, everything intact. Those images went around the world. Some headlines framed it as Musk's Starship miserably drowning. Others called it the start of a new era for spaceflight. You decide which one you believe. I'm going with the latter. SpaceX delivered footage to match, something that would have seemed nearly impossible just a few years ago. At a glance, Flight 13 was everything we'd hoped for. The booster flew up and came back down, aside from a rough landing burn. The ship kept all 6 Raptors running through cutoff, completed its in-space relight, and the heat shield held up again. No burn-through like in past flights, just a handful of cracked or missing tiles. It survived exceptionally well. Flight 13 answered the biggest open questions Flight 12 left behind. V3 is ready for the next step. And this is where it gets exciting again. Now comes the string of firsts on the road to the moon. Ship catching is next, proving out full reusability the next time a ship flies. We've already seen SpaceX pull that off with the booster, but watching a ship come home to a catch will be something else entirely. The big news came right after the flight, and has already been confirmed by Musk. Barring any problems found during mission data review, SpaceX will attempt to catch the ship with the tower on the next flight. That next flight is likely in August. After that, orbital refueling. And then the big one, HLS, the human lander variant, slated to bring people back to the moon just 2 years from now. Excitement guaranteed, and I'll be here with you every step of the way. That's it for today. Smash that like button, subscribe for more. That's what feeds the algorithm and how you can support us for free. Check out our shirts over at your favorite Space Nerd store, our all-time favorite Raptor engine design, and plenty more waiting for you. Link in the description, US and worldwide shipping. History is being written in real time. If you want to catch up on other historic stories from recent weeks, click the video on screen and keep the journey going. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.